The year was 1884. The streets of America buzzed with politics, debates, and campaign posters, yet no one was talking about the quiet storm brewing behind the grand doors of one of the nation's most powerful men, Grover Cleveland. On the surface, he was a model of honesty, a Democrat promising reform, a man of principle in a time when corruption was the rule rather than the exception. But whispers had begun to circulate, rumors that threatened to undo his carefully cultivated image. Cleveland's opponents had discovered a story that could have ended any political career. A young child named Ruth Cleveland, born to a woman named Maria Halpin. Maria was a troubled figure by many accounts, a single mother navigating the harsh realities of late 19th century life. And according to her claim, Grover Cleveland was the father. Newspapers loved it. The story was salacious, scandalous, and perfect for political mudslinging. Editors delighted in headlines that implied Cleveland's hypocrisy and moral failing, calling him a father who had abandoned his child. The question on everyone's lips, Ma, where's my pa? Cleveland was caught in a historical paradox. Unlike today, there were no viral videos, number 24-hour news cycles, but the press wielded power in a way that could quietly destroy reputations with ink and paper. Cleveland had to navigate this minefield carefully. Publicly, he denied the allegations, stating that he had never knowingly wronged a woman. Privately, he faced a delicate balancing act. Acknowledging responsibility could destroy his campaign, while denying it outright might seem cold or evasive. The story grew more tangled as Maria Halpin's life unfolded in parallel with Cleveland's rising fame. She had been institutionalized at one point, a move rumored to be orchestrated by Cleveland's allies. Some historians believe this was a calculated attempt to silence her, to keep the story from reaching voters at the crucial moment of the election. Others argue it was merely the product of the era's legal and medical systems, which often treated women as unstable or unfit whenever their behavior didn't conform to societal expectations. Whatever the truth, the public only saw the drama, the whispered questions about morality, and the shadows of the president-to-be's private life. And then there was little Ruth. The child's existence became a symbol, a tangible reminder of the scandal. She was the reason the story lingered in whispers, a living, breathing accusation, a miniature figure who could not speak but whose mere presence threatened the reputation of a man striving for the highest office in the land. Newspapers occasionally mentioned her, sometimes sympathetically, sometimes mockingly, but always with the implication that her father's hands had somehow failed to protect her. Cleveland's political opponents seized every opportunity to paint him as a man who could not be trusted with either moral or civic responsibility. Campaign pamphlets included subtle references to his alleged paternity. Political cartoons depicted him surrounded by shadows of children, and satirical articles questioned whether he could manage the affairs of state when he could not manage his personal life. It was a masterclass in 19th century political warfare. No emails, no social media, just ink, paper, and public curiosity. And yet, Cleveland persisted. Somehow, he navigated the storm. His campaign framed him as a man of principle besieged by falsehoods, and the public, perhaps weary of endless accusations against politicians, ultimately sided with him. He won the presidency, proving that sometimes reputation and resilience could outweigh scandal. But the whispers never fully disappeared. Historians still debate the extent of Cleveland's involvement with Maria Halpin, and whether he acted with cruelty, neglect, or simply the caution of a man trying to preserve his career. Letters, court records, and contemporaneous accounts offer tantalizing hints, yet no definitive answer. The story sits in the shadows of American history, a reminder that even the most powerful men in the country have private lives full of complexity, moral ambiguity, and, sometimes, outright scandal. The Cleveland affair, small by today's standards of political indiscretion, set a precedent for public scrutiny of presidential private life. It demonstrated that voters have always been intrigued by the human flaws of leaders, by the intimate choices they make behind closed doors. And it began a pattern that would continue through the centuries. Presidents haunted not just by policies and wars, but by whispers of love, desire, and betrayal. As the nation moved forward into the Gilded Age, the shadow of Grover Cleveland's secret lingered, quietly reminding Americans that even in the highest offices, no man or woman was immune to scandal. The story of Ruth Cleveland and her mysterious father is more than gossip. It is a mirror reflecting the eternal tension between private life and public expectation, a tension that would define the White House for generations to come. If Grover Cleveland's scandal was whispered in the 1880s, Warren G. Harding's affairs roared in the 1910s and 1920s. echoing through newspapers and the halls of political power alike. Harding, a man known for his affable charm and easy smile, seemed the very image of Midwestern decency. Yet beneath that genial exterior lurked a private life rife with clandestine romance and dangerous liaisons. Before Harding ever ascended to the presidency, he had begun a secret correspondence with a woman named Carrie Phillips. Letters discovered decades later revealed the depth of their connection. Not casual flirtation, but a persistent, emotionally charged attachment. Carrie, married but frustrated in her own domestic life, became more than a mistress. She was a confidant, someone who understood the pressures Harding faced as a rising politician. Their letters carried an intimacy that went far beyond words, blending flirtation with politics, affection with veiled threats, and occasional bursts of jealousy that hinted at Harding's own volatility. Harding's relationship with Carrie was fraught not only with moral danger but political peril. Some historians argue that Carrie Phillips may have shared Harding's correspondence with German agents during World War I, though evidence remains debated. Regardless, the potential for scandal was enormous. For a politician, being caught in an affair could spell the end of a career, and in Harding's case, it would have endangered the delicate balance of post-war American politics. The stakes were higher than just personal reputation. They were tied to international perception, and possibly, to national security. But Harding's secret life did not end with Carrie. There was Nan Britton, a young woman from Ohio who boldly claimed that Harding had fathered her child, Elizabeth Ann, born in 1919. Unlike the discreet letters with Carrie, Britton's affair exploded into the public eye. She published a book, The President's Daughter, revealing intimate details of their encounters, and America's collective gasp filled newspapers and parlors alike. For the first time, the public could imagine the private bed of a sitting president, and the resulting scandal tested the limits of societal tolerance. Some dismissed Britton as opportunistic, others as a truth-teller exposing the hidden indulgences of political power. The contrast between Harding's public persona and private actions was stark. In speeches and appearances, he projected wholesomeness, statesmanship, and moral rectitude. Behind closed doors, he navigated a web of romantic entanglements that required careful concealment, delicate lies, and occasional emotional manipulation. It was a balancing act that, if mismanaged, could have toppled him. Yet Harding, like Cleveland before him, survived the immediate consequences, though history would remember the affairs long after his death. Harding's mistresses also highlight the gendered dimensions of scandal. Women in these stories bore the brunt of public scrutiny, often vilified or sensationalized by the press, while the men involved retained much of their authority and dignity. Carrie Phillips was alternately painted as a schemer and a devoted lover. Nan Britton faced ridicule and moral judgment that often overshadowed the complexities of her relationship with the president. Harding himself became a symbol of masculine charm, forgiven in the court of public opinion for indulgences that would have destroyed a woman's reputation. The political implications of these affairs were not trivial. Harding's administration, already navigating the tumult of post-war America, could not afford a public scandal that would weaken confidence in the executive branch. The press, ever hungry for a story, threatened to unravel the careful image of the president. Yet Harding's charm, his reputation for affability, and the skill of his advisors ensured that the most damaging elements remained private, at least until after his death in 1923. Only then did historians and journalists fully piece together the depth of Harding's secret life, revealing a tapestry of desire, secrecy, and political calculation. These affairs, though scandalous, were part of a larger pattern in American political life: the tension between private desire and public expectation. Presidents were expected to embody moral perfection. Yet history shows that behind the doors of the White House, human passion rarely respected political boundaries. Harding's story is a vivid example: letters hidden in drawers, late-night meetings in shadowed rooms, children born in secrecy, all quietly shaping the course of history. In examining Harding's personal life, one begins to see a broader lesson about power. Authority and desire are often intertwined, and the very qualities that make a man appealing in politics, charm, charisma, the ability to persuade and attract, can also make him dangerously vulnerable to scandal. Harding's ability to maintain political success while engaging in multiple secret relationships demonstrates the delicate dance between public perception and private indulgence. By the end of Harding's presidency, the affairs he carried quietly with him were no longer just a matter of personal curiosity. They were historical signposts, reminders that behind the pomp and ceremony of the White House, the lives of presidents are shaped as much by their passions and peccadillos as by legislation and policy. The story of Warren G. Harding, Carrie Phillips, and Nan Britton remains a cautionary tale, illustrating that the allure of secret romance has always been part of America's political fabric, weaving together power, desire, and history in a way that continues to fascinate. When most people think of Eleanor Roosevelt, they picture the tireless activist, the first lady who transformed the role into one of political influence, social advocacy, and moral authority. They imagine her standing behind the podium, pen in hand, advocating for civil rights, or visiting refugee camps with an unwavering gaze of compassion. What they rarely imagine, however, is a deeply intimate, emotionally charged relationship that would remain hidden from the public eye for decades, one that revealed another, more private dimension of Eleanor's extraordinary life. Lorena Hickok, a reporter for the Associated Press, arrived on the scene in the early 1930s. She was professional, ambitious, and devoted to her craft. She was also quietly fascinated by Eleanor, first as a prominent political figure, then as a woman who seemed larger than life. The correspondence between them began innocuously enough, letters exchanged about public appearances, speeches, and political matters. But gradually, they became intensely personal, revealing layers of Eleanor's inner world that few could access. Eleanor's letters to Hickok, many preserved in archives today, are remarkable in their candor. She confided about her fears, her insecurities, and the loneliness she felt despite her immense responsibilities. She shared details of her marriage to Franklin D. Roosevelt, a union both profoundly loving and fraught with complexity. And woven throughout these letters was a tenderness and emotional intimacy that suggested a bond deeper than mere friendship. Hickok was often described by historians as Eleanor's closest confidant, someone with whom she could share the secret corners of her heart. Yet the story grows more compelling when considering the social and political context of the time. In the 1930s and 1940s, a woman in Eleanor's position had little room for deviation from public expectations. Any hint of impropriety, particularly in matters of romance or emotional attachment outside marriage, could have destroyed her carefully cultivated image and hindered her husband's presidency. The letters between Eleanor and Hickok were written with caution, yet their emotional intensity speaks for itself. In the margins of political life, Eleanor found solace, companionship, and perhaps even love. Franklin Roosevelt's own personal life complicates the narrative further. While Eleanor was cultivating a private, emotional relationship with Hickok, Franklin maintained several extramarital affairs. These were often quietly known among close circles, whispered in the halls of power but seldom acknowledged publicly. Historians argue that Eleanor and Franklin may have had a tacit understanding, a recognition that personal fulfillment did not always align neatly with societal expectation. Eleanor's letters suggest that she was both aware of Franklin's indiscretions and deeply affected by them, channeling her emotional energies into her connection with Hickok and her relentless public work. The Eleanor-Hickok relationship is fascinating not only because of its intensity but because of its secrecy. Unlike presidential affairs that erupted into public scandal, theirs remained largely private. The intimacy was emotional rather than physical, at least in any documented form, yet it shaped Eleanor's worldview and informed her public persona. Letters describe days spent together in correspondence, shared confessions, and a level of trust that transcended ordinary friendship. Eleanor wrote with vulnerability, exposing fears and desires she could never articulate in the public sphere. Historians studying this relationship emphasize its significance in understanding the evolution of the American presidency and the role of the First Lady. Eleanor's ability to maintain emotional resilience, public poise, and political influence was intertwined with her private correspondence with Hickok. It provided her a space to explore the emotional depth of her own identity, away from the pressures of Washington, the scrutiny of the press, and the expectations of society. In many ways, the letters are as historic as any policy memo or speech, revealing the personal stakes behind political life. The story also sheds light on broader themes of love, companionship, and societal norms. In a time when women were expected to adhere to strict moral codes, Eleanor's letters demonstrate how emotional intimacy could be a radical, even subversive act. She navigated a complex world of power, expectation, and personal desire, maintaining both her public influence and her private autonomy. The letters to Hickok show that human connection often transcends conventional labels, offering insight into a life lived on the margins of both society and history. Even decades later, the relationship between Eleanor and Hickok continues to captivate historians and the public alike. It challenges simplistic narratives about love, marriage, and gender roles in early 20th century America. Eleanor Roosevelt, the paragon of political virtue, had a private life filled with emotional depth, longing, and connection. A reminder that history is never as tidy as it seems, and that the lives of the powerful are often intertwined with secrets, desire, and complicated human bonds. The story of Eleanor and Hickok is a window into the intimate, often hidden dimensions of life in the White House. It illuminates the pressures faced by women in positions of influence, the delicate negotiations required in balancing public and private identity, and the ways in which emotional attachment can shape history. Behind every presidential policy, every public appearance, and every speech, there is a personal story, one of longing, trust, and profound human connection. The presidency of John F. Kennedy has been immortalized in history books and popular culture as Camelot, a time of youthful optimism, glamorous public appearances, and inspiring speeches. The image of JFK, perfectly coiffed, charismatic, and photogenic, remains etched in the American imagination. Yet behind the polished smile and the televised charm, the reality of his private life was far more complex, filled with secretive liaisons, hidden passion, and a pattern of behavior that would have scandalized the public if fully revealed at the time. John F. Kennedy, often called Jack by his friends, possessed a magnetic charm that drew people to him, particularly women. From the corridors of the White House to private vacation retreats, Kennedy's life was punctuated by moments of intimacy with multiple women, some of whom were well-known public figures, and others who were private acquaintances or staff members. Historians have documented alleged relationships with actresses, socialites, and even women connected to political circles, each encounter cloaked in secrecy, yet forming a significant part of the man behind the office. The most infamous of these was his alleged relationship with Marilyn Monroe. While many Americans only associate Monroe with her silver screen persona, her rumored connections with Kennedy have fueled decades of speculation. Accounts suggest private meetings in New York and Hollywood, whispered phone calls, and the shared thrill of secrecy. While concrete evidence remains elusive, the story persists, capturing the imagination of generations and illustrating the tension between celebrity, power, and desire. Yet Monroe was far from the only woman in Kennedy's private orbit. From White House staffers to political aides, Kennedy allegedly cultivated a web of relationships that required careful navigation to avoid public scandal. Letters, photographs, and oral histories suggest that his charm and status allowed him to orchestrate encounters with discretion, though the potential for exposure was always present. These relationships were not merely casual. For some, they represented emotional connections, flirtation, and a dangerous thrill born from the secrecy imposed by his office. The contrast between Kennedy's public and private life highlights a recurring theme in the history of American presidents: the delicate balance between perception and reality. In public, Kennedy embodied a forward-looking vision for the nation, emphasizing civil rights, international diplomacy, and inspiring rhetoric. Privately, he navigated his desires, relationships, and temptations with a level of discretion that allowed him to maintain his public image. This dichotomy underscores the challenges inherent in presidential life, the tension between human vulnerability and the expectations of leadership. JFK's personal relationships also influenced those around him in profound ways. Jacqueline Kennedy, his wife, navigated the public and private dimensions of her marriage with grace and stoicism, projecting the image of the ideal First Lady while managing the emotional complexities of her husband's extramarital activities. Staff members, aides, and confidants were often drawn into this web of secrecy, tasked with protecting the president's image while observing the human drama unfold behind closed doors. The White House, in these years, became both a stage and a private theater, where the lives of those involved were shaped by discretion, loyalty, and sometimes unspoken tension. The alleged affairs of John F. Kennedy also reflect broader societal attitudes toward sexuality, power, and gender. The press of the early 1960s exercised restraint, often refraining from publishing sensational details about the president's private life. Unlike the hyper-scrutinized political landscape of today, Kennedy could maintain a level of privacy that modern politicians might find unimaginable. Nevertheless, the whispers persisted, shaping public perception and contributing to a mythology that continues to fascinate historians and the general public alike. In retrospect, Kennedy's secret romances provide a lens into the interplay of power, desire, and discretion. They remind us that the office of the presidency, while highly visible, has always been inhabited by humans with private lives, complex emotions, and appetites that do not neatly conform to public expectation. The stories of these liaisons are more than gossip. They are insights into the personal dimensions of leadership, the moral ambiguities of power, and the enduring fascination Americans have with the intimate lives of their leaders. By the time Kennedy's presidency came to a tragic end in 1963, the world knew him as the emblem of a new, hopeful era. What remained largely hidden were the intricate, sometimes scandalous, aspects of his personal life, the affairs, the flirtations, the secret rendezvous that played out behind the locked doors of the White House. These stories, emerging slowly through biographies, declassified documents, and memoirs, reveal a man whose life was as dramatic and captivating in private as it was in the public eye, forever complicating the image of Camelot and reminding us that history is always shaped by the interplay of public accomplishment and private desire. By the time Bill Clinton took office in 1993, the White House had long been a stage not only for political theater but for human drama. Presidents had always balanced the pressures of governance with the temptations of personal desire. Yet in Clinton's era, media scrutiny and public expectation had intensified to unprecedented levels. What might once have been whispered in corridors or discreetly reported in the society pages was now broadcast, analyzed, and debated across every channel and platform. And in this environment, Clinton's private life would erupt into one of the most notorious presidential scandals in American history. The central figure in this story, Monica Lewinsky, was a young intern who found herself at the intersection of ambition, innocence, and political intrigue. Accounts of the affair suggest a dynamic that was simultaneously thrilling, secretive, and fraught with risk. Meetings took place behind closed doors in the White House, often in locations where they were unlikely to be observed by staff or visitors. These encounters were characterized by both secrecy and intensity, fueled by the allure of proximity to power, the thrill of risk, and the human need for connection. Clinton's charm and charisma, honed over decades of political life, played a crucial role in the unfolding drama. He was known for his engaging personality, quick wit, and ability to form bonds with those around him, traits that had served him well in politics but also made personal entanglements inevitable. Lewinsky, by many accounts, was both drawn to and intimidated by the president's power and magnetism. Their interactions reveal the complex interplay between authority, desire, and consent in an environment charged with hierarchical dynamics. The scandal was not merely personal. It became a national spectacle, reshaping public discourse around morality, power, and accountability. When the affair became public, it ignited debates across political, legal, and social spheres. The impeachment proceedings, centered on issues of perjury and obstruction of justice, turned private behavior into a legal and political crisis. The intensity of media coverage transformed the personal drama into a story consumed by millions, illustrating the unique pressures that modern presidents face when their private lives intersect with public scrutiny. Lewinsky's own perspective adds depth to the narrative. In later interviews and writings, she described the emotional complexity of her relationship with the president, the fear of exposure, and the profound consequences of public revelation. For Clinton, the scandal forced a confrontation between his private impulses and the responsibilities of office, creating a tension that would define the latter half of his presidency. The affair, while intimate in nature, had repercussions that rippled through the fabric of American politics, influencing public perception, party dynamics, and the relationship between citizens and their government. The Clinton-Lewinsky scandal also highlights the evolving role of women in political narratives. Lewinsky, initially vilified in popular discourse, became emblematic of the way female figures are scrutinized, judged, and often blamed for the actions of powerful men. Her story raises questions about agency, power, and the gendered dimensions of scandal, themes that have resonated across other presidential affairs throughout history. Clinton, by contrast, navigated the scandal with political acumen, managing public appearances, speeches, and apologies in a manner that allowed him to retain office and influence despite widespread criticism. At its core, the affair demonstrates the enduring tension between human desire and public duty. Presidents, no matter how capable or visionary, remain susceptible to personal temptation. Clinton's experience is a stark reminder that the White House is not only a seat of government but also a private stage where human drama unfolds, often with consequences that extend far beyond the walls of the Oval Office. The affair, like those of Harding or Kennedy, illustrates that desire, secrecy, and scandal have long been intertwined with political power, and that the personal lives of leaders often shape history in ways both subtle and profound. In the aftermath, the story of Clinton and Lewinsky became more than a scandal. It became a case study in the intersection of politics, media, and personal morality. Scholars, journalists, and the public alike analyzed every detail, drawing lessons about power dynamics, the ethics of leadership, and the human vulnerabilities of those in positions of authority. It remains one of the most vivid examples in modern American history of how private relationships, when exposed, can influence national consciousness and public discourse. Ultimately, the Clinton-Lewinsky affair underscores a persistent theme in the saga of White House romances: the collision of private desire with public responsibility. It reminds us that presidents, regardless of their vision, intellect, or political skill, remain human, subject to temptation, emotional impulses, and the sometimes catastrophic consequences of exposure. In examining this scandal, alongside the stories of Kennedy, Harding, and Roosevelt, we gain insight not only into the nature of political power but into the complex, often hidden human stories that unfold behind the gilded doors of the nation's most famous residents. The presidency of Donald J. Trump represents a radically different era in American political life, one in which media saturation, celebrity culture, and the omnipresence of social media transformed the public's relationship with the personal lives of leaders. Unlike previous administrations, where secrecy and discretion often concealed private indiscretions, Trump's tenure was characterized by a uniquely public blend of personality, power, and controversy. Extramarital rumors, affairs, and accusations were not just whispered behind closed doors. They became front-page news, fuel for cable television, and viral content for the digital age. Trump's relationships with women prior to and during his presidency were frequently reported in the media, from affairs alleged in the 1980s and 1990s to controversial interactions with adult film actress Stormy Daniels and other women during his political career. Each allegation carried legal, political, and social ramifications, drawing attention not only to the personal choices of a president but to the broader implications of power, influence, and gender dynamics in the highest office of the United States. The stories were sensational, yet they also reveal patterns of behavior that illuminate both Trump's character and the evolving expectations of public accountability. The way Trump navigated these controversies differed markedly from earlier presidents. In an era of instantaneous media coverage, where Twitter posts could reach millions within minutes, traditional notions of privacy were effectively obliterated. Trump's responses to allegations were often confrontational, combative, or dismissive, reflecting both his personal style and his understanding of media manipulation. Whereas Kennedy's or Clinton's affairs were characterized by secrecy and eventual exposure, Trump's alleged extramarital encounters became public almost immediately, turning private life into an ongoing spectacle of entertainment and political narrative. These incidents also shaped public perception of Trump's presidency. Supporters often dismissed allegations as politically motivated, emphasizing his leadership style, policy initiatives, or perceived authenticity. Critics, however, interpreted the stories as evidence of moral failings, character flaws, and a disregard for traditional ethical norms. The tension between these perspectives underscores the complex role of personal behavior in contemporary politics, a dynamic in which private indiscretions can amplify political polarization, shape voter opinion, and influence media narratives. One of the most notable aspects of Trump's affairs is how they intersected with power dynamics in the workplace and the broader societal conversation about consent, exploitation, and privilege. Allegations often involved individuals in positions of less authority than the president, highlighting questions about coercion, consent, and the ethical responsibilities of those in power. In many ways, the controversies surrounding Trump reflect a broader societal reckoning with sexual behavior, accountability, and the rights of individuals to autonomy and protection from exploitation, particularly in highly hierarchical environments. The Trump era also demonstrates the ways in which modern scandal differs from historical precedent. In contrast to Kennedy or Clinton, whose affairs required concealment, Trump's alleged indiscretions played out in a media ecosystem designed for maximum exposure. The rapid spread of information, coupled with the proliferation of opinion-driven content, meant that every claim, denial, and counterclaim became fodder for public debate. This transparency, paradoxically, both magnified the personal behavior of the president and diminished the private nature of scandal, blending the boundaries between personal, political, and performative life in ways previously unimaginable. Beyond the media spectacle, these stories reveal a consistent theme in presidential history: the collision of power and desire. Just as Kennedy, Clinton, and Roosevelt navigated the tension between private longing and public duty, Trump's relationships with women, whether consensual or contested, illuminate the interplay of personality, authority, and human vulnerability. They provide insight into how individuals wielding immense influence negotiate their personal lives, and how those negotiations ripple outward to affect the public perception of leadership, morality, and accountability. Moreover, Trump's affairs highlight the generational shift in public tolerance for personal scandal. Whereas earlier presidents could maintain political influence despite secretive relationships, the modern electorate engages with these stories immediately, often through the lens of social media and viral content. The speed of information, coupled with cultural movements emphasizing accountability and transparency, ensures that personal behavior is inseparable from political reputation. For historians, political scientists, and cultural observers, this represents a new chapter in the long-standing narrative of power and intimacy in the White House. Ultimately, the stories of Donald Trump's alleged affairs, while sensational, are part of a continuum of private lives shaping public history. From Roosevelt's secret correspondence to Kennedy's hidden romances, from Clinton's scandalous encounters to Trump's highly publicized allegations, the American presidency has always been a stage where human desire, secrecy, and morality intersect with national governance. Examining these narratives allows us to understand not only the individual lives of presidents but the societal norms, media ecosystems, and historical contexts that make such stories both possible and compelling. In the end, the Trump era underscores a truth that resonates across centuries. The human heart, with all its passions and flaws, can never be fully contained by the walls of the White House, no matter how much power, fame, or influence resides within. The affairs, controversies, and scandals are reminders that history is as much about people, with all their desires, mistakes, and secrets, as it is about policy, legislation, and national events. Looking back over centuries of American presidential history, a clear pattern emerges. The private lives of leaders have consistently intersected with public perception, shaping both their legacies and the national discourse. From the early days of the Republic to the modern era, presidents have grappled with the tension between human desire and the responsibilities of office. The stories of Roosevelt, Kennedy, Clinton, and Trump illustrate recurring themes: charm and charisma, secrecy and discretion, temptation and exposure, and the persistent influence of gender and power dynamics. The early presidents, though less documented in popular media, were not immune to private entanglements. Letters, diaries, and historical accounts suggest that personal relationships and affairs existed even in the 18th and 19th centuries, though the details were often obscured by time and the limited reach of newspapers. In these eras, discretion was key, and society often turned a blind eye to the private indiscretions of men in positions of authority, particularly when public achievement outweighed personal conduct. The narrative of secrecy and discretion is a consistent thread, highlighting the long-standing human challenge of reconciling private impulses with public duty. John F. Kennedy's affairs exemplify the delicate balance between charm and discretion, ambition and desire. His romances, often with women in positions of power, proximity, or influence, were conducted in ways designed to avoid scandal, yet they reveal much about the human vulnerabilities of those in office. Kennedy's story also underscores the role of women in these narratives. Figures like Jacqueline Kennedy navigated public and private dimensions of marriage with grace, while women involved in secret liaisons often faced emotional and social consequences, highlighting the gendered aspects of historical scandal. The Clinton-Lewinsky affair and its subsequent fallout illustrate the evolving media landscape and public expectations. By the late 20th century, presidents could no longer rely on silence or discretion to protect their private lives. Instantaneous media coverage transformed personal indiscretions into national events, forcing leaders to respond publicly and shaping historical narratives in real time. The scandal illuminated issues of consent, power dynamics, and ethical responsibility, emphasizing how presidential behavior resonates beyond the walls of the White House and influences societal attitudes toward leadership and morality. Donald Trump's highly publicized controversies further demonstrate the impact of media evolution on presidential scandal. The speed of digital news, social media amplification, and constant public scrutiny created an environment in which private behavior was inseparable from political perception. Trump's tenure highlights how modern presidents navigate both human desire and a relentless media ecosystem, illustrating a fundamental shift from the hidden romances of the past to the public spectacles of the present. Despite these differences, certain constants remain. Presidential allure, charm, charisma, and status continues to draw attention, while discretion, secrecy, and careful management of perception remain critical. Gender dynamics, too, persist as a central theme. Women involved in presidential affairs have historically faced societal judgment, social scrutiny, and reputational risk, often disproportionately compared to their male counterparts. These recurring patterns reveal much about both the office of the presidency and the broader societal attitudes towards sexuality, power, and morality. Historical scandals also offer lessons in human nature and the pressures of leadership. The stories of presidential affairs remind us that those in positions of immense power remain human, with desires, flaws, and vulnerabilities. Understanding these narratives provides context for public behavior, policy decisions, and the cultural lens through which leaders are judged. It also offers insight into the evolution of media, morality, and societal norms, revealing how public scrutiny has intensified over time, yet the underlying dynamics of temptation and secrecy remain remarkably consistent. Another lesson from history is the enduring fascination of the public with presidential intimacy. Scandals, rumors, and confirmed affairs captivate audiences because they humanize leaders, revealing the private dimensions behind the grandeur of office. Americans are drawn to these stories not simply for sensationalism, but for the insight they provide into the interplay of power, desire, and accountability. Each revelation, whether hidden or publicized, contributes to a larger narrative about what it means to wield authority while navigating personal impulses. Finally, the recurring presence of scandal emphasizes the necessity of historical perspective. Presidents are often remembered for their public achievements, wars, legislation, and speeches, but their private lives also shape legacies in profound ways. By studying the affairs, romances, and controversies of leaders across centuries, historians and the public alike gain a richer understanding of both human nature and the institution of the presidency. These stories remind us that the personal is always intertwined with the political, and that the White House, while a symbol of power, has consistently been a stage for human drama. In sum, patterns of presidential scandal reveal the enduring tension between human desire and public responsibility. They illuminate gendered dynamics, the evolution of media scrutiny, and the complex ways in which private behavior shapes historical memory. From the early days of the Republic to the modern era, American presidents have lived under a constant balancing act, managing power, ambition, and public perception while navigating the universal impulses that define human life. By examining these patterns, we gain not only a deeper understanding of individual leaders but also insight into the persistent interplay of intimacy, morality, and authority in the highest office of the United States. Presidential scandals have always carried consequences that reach far beyond the private lives of leaders. While affairs, romances, and indiscretions may begin behind closed doors, their exposure invariably shapes public perception, political legitimacy, and historical legacy. From Thomas Jefferson's rumored relationships to Clinton's highly publicized encounters, Americans have long scrutinized the personal morality of their presidents, weighing it alongside political accomplishments. The intersection of human desire and public duty illustrates a recurring tension. How much of a president's private behavior should influence how they are remembered, respected, or judged? Public trust has historically been fragile, particularly when allegations of impropriety surface. In the early Republic, rumors of private affairs were sometimes dismissed or quietly ignored. But as the media evolved and literacy rates increased, private behavior became more visible and consequential. By the 20th century, the press wielded immense power in shaping narratives about the personal lives of presidents. Investigative journalism, tabloids, and eventually digital media created a feedback loop in which private indiscretions quickly became national debates. This evolving visibility forced presidents to navigate their private desires with unprecedented caution, or risk political and personal ruin. Clinton's affair with Monica Lewinsky serves as a prime example of the delicate balance between personal choice and public consequence. The exposure of the affair not only led to impeachment proceedings but also provoked widespread national discourse about ethics, power, and accountability. For many Americans, the scandal challenged preconceived notions of morality and leadership and highlighted the growing influence of mass media on public opinion. The personal decisions of a single president could sway national sentiment, spark political divisions, and leave a lasting mark on history. Donald Trump's controversies further illustrate how public trust is shaped in the modern era. Allegations of extramarital behavior and publicized interactions with women sparked debates across media platforms, social networks, and political arenas. Unlike previous generations, where secrecy could contain scandal, the immediacy of modern communication ensured that private actions became public almost instantly. The result was a heightened sense of scrutiny, where the court of public opinion operated in parallel with official investigations and political maneuvering. Public trust, in such an environment, is fluid and highly responsive to perceived ethical conduct. Historical patterns reveal that the fallout from scandal is not evenly distributed. Often, women involved in these affairs bear disproportionate social and reputational consequences, while male presidents navigate public perception with relative resilience. From Kennedy's mistresses to Lewinsky, to the women connected to Trump's controversies, gender dynamics play a central role in shaping narratives and influencing public response. Understanding these dynamics provides insight into broader cultural attitudes toward morality, power, and the accountability of those in authority. The legacy of scandal also depends on the broader political and historical context. While some affairs have temporarily damaged reputations, others have faded from collective memory, overshadowed by significant policy achievements or historical events. Harding's and Kennedy's affairs, though noteworthy, are often remembered alongside their respective political triumphs and failures. In contrast, Clinton's scandal was amplified by the evolving media landscape, making it a defining moment in both his presidency and modern political discourse. The extent to which scandal shapes legacy is thus intertwined with societal norms, media influence, and the cultural moment in which it unfolds. Scandals also provide critical lessons for historians and the public alike. They reveal the human vulnerabilities of those entrusted with immense power, illustrating that leadership is not merely a function of intellect, strategy, or policy expertise. It also requires navigating personal impulses, maintaining ethical standards, and understanding the impact of one's behavior on national trust. Each scandal becomes a case study in the interplay of power, desire, and public responsibility, reminding us that history is as much about human behavior as it is about legislation, war, or diplomacy. Furthermore, the public's fascination with presidential scandals speaks to a deeper cultural curiosity about power and intimacy. Scandals humanize leaders, offering glimpses into the private dimensions of individuals who otherwise appear distant or exalted. This curiosity is enduring, shaping political dialogue, influencing media coverage, and guiding public engagement with history. Americans, across centuries, have consistently been drawn to these narratives, seeking both moral lessons and the compelling drama of human desire intersecting with institutional authority. Ultimately, the scandals of the White House demonstrate that personal conduct cannot be fully separated from public office. The choices made behind closed doors echo across corridors of power, shaping public trust, influencing policy debates, and leaving a lasting imprint on historical memory. Understanding these patterns allows us to view presidential history through a more nuanced lens, one that acknowledges both the achievements and the human frailties of those who have led the nation. In conclusion, the legacy of White House affairs is inseparable from the broader narrative of American history. From Jefferson to Trump, each scandal reflects the interplay of morality, media, power, and societal expectation. By examining the consequences of these affairs on public trust and historical reputation, we gain insight into the enduring tension between private desire and public duty, a tension that continues to define the presidency and captivate the American imagination. By the mid-20th century, the White House had grown into a fortress, not just of political power, but of image control. Rumors had to be managed like delicate explosives, and every whisper that escaped the gates was considered a threat to the presidency itself. It was no longer the era of Jefferson's subtle denials or Cleveland's careful press statements. By now, there were entire teams dedicated to making sure certain stories never saw the light of day. One of the most famous examples involves John F. Kennedy, whose reputation as a charismatic family man was part of his political brand. But behind closed doors, Kennedy's private life was far more complicated and riskier. Multiple accounts, from former staff, journalists, and biographers, suggest that JFK was notoriously unfaithful, often arranging clandestine meetings with women inside the White House itself. Some names became legend, like actress Marilyn Monroe, whose breathy happy birthday, Mr. President at Madison Square Garden still sends chills down history's spine. Monroe's rumored connection to Kennedy, and possibly to his brother Robert, became the kind of dangerous entanglement that could derail a presidency if exposed. The problem wasn't just moral outrage, it was security. In the paranoid climate of the Cold War, any personal vulnerability could be weaponized by foreign intelligence. It was whispered that the Secret Service sometimes acted not only as bodyguards but as quiet facilitators, making sure meetings happened without leaving a trace. There were no smartphones in 1962, But they were still reporters with notebooks, and the administration worked hard to keep them at arm's length. This instinct to suppress stories wasn't unique to Kennedy. Franklin D. Roosevelt, decades earlier, had maintained a long-running relationship with Lucy Mercer, his wife's former secretary, even as he served 4 terms as president. It was an open secret among his inner circle, but the press never touched it. Partly because the relationship between journalists and presidents was different then. Reporters often saw themselves as protectors of the presidency, not just observers. It wasn't until years after FDR's death that the public learned the full extent of his relationship with Mercer, and how she had been at Warm Springs with him the day he died. And then there were the smaller, stranger cover-ups, the ones history barely remembers. A visiting dignitary's wife who had to be quietly escorted out after a private meeting went on too long. A staff member dismissed overnight for knowing too much. An intercepted letter, never delivered, because it hinted at an affair that crossed national borders. In each case, the White House machinery moved quickly, quietly, and with one goal: to make the problem vanish. What's striking is how little the public knew at the time, and how much of that was intentional. Today, presidential scandals break in hours, spreading across the internet in real time. But in the past, affairs could go on for years without the average citizen hearing a single rumor. It was a different game, one where secrecy wasn't just about preserving a president's marriage, it was about preserving the illusion that the office itself was untouched by human weakness. Of course, illusions always have cracks. And sometimes, all it took was one photograph, one careless phone call, or one betrayal from within to shatter it. Those moments, when the truth slipped through, would change the way Americans saw not only their leaders, but the presidency itself. In Washington, secrets were not just whispered, they were traded like currency. Behind the closed doors of smoky back rooms, in the soft glow of late-night dinners, an invisible network of confidants kept the wheels of gossip turning. It was a world where a secretary might know more about the First Lady's private thoughts than her own husband, and a butler could carry knowledge that could topple reputations. It was said that the capital had 2 governments, one made of laws, and another made of whispers. The second one moved faster, cut deeper, and was far more dangerous. Anyone who stayed in Washington long enough learned quickly that your greatest weapon was not your position, but your discretion. The 1920s were a prime example. The city had begun to loosen its collar after the stiffness of the Victorian age. Jazz spilled from private clubs, liquor, despite prohibition, flowed freely at political gatherings, and flirtation became a subtle dance woven into the fabric of power. Here, a senator's aide might pass along a juicy rumor to a reporter, not for money, but for the satisfaction of knowing the right story would land in the right ear. And when the whispers reached the public, they were rarely the full truth, just sharp fragments designed to wound. One particularly notorious case involved the wife of a powerful cabinet member who was seen slipping into the Willard Hotel well past midnight. The sighting made its way from a bellboy to a bartender, then to the city's social circles. By the time it reached a political rival, it had been twisted into a story of an ongoing affair with a foreign ambassador. The truth: she had been arranging a charity donation in private, but no one cared about the truth when the scandal was far more entertaining. For staffers inside the White House, survival meant keeping your mouth shut, at least publicly. Privately, the quiet exchange of stories acted as a strange form of bonding. A maid might casually mention that the president's mood had been unusually light after a late-night meeting with a lady visitor, and a chef might reply with an anecdote about the sudden addition of champagne to the menu. It wasn't malicious gossip so much as it was the invisible glue holding together a world where appearances were everything. In this way, the White House itself became a kind of stage, and its staff the backstage crew, all of them privy to the unscripted scenes the public never saw. The official narratives were carefully managed. Photographs of the first family smiling on the South Lawn, speeches about integrity and sacrifice, carefully worded statements about the unity of the nation. But just out of frame, there was always a shadow story, whispered in kitchens, scribbled in private letters, and passed between trusted friends. Those whispers, though, had a strange way of shaping reality. A rumor, repeated enough times, could harden into a kind of truth that no denial could erase. In Washington, it was not enough to be innocent, you had to be above suspicion. And even the most careful players could find themselves at the mercy of the whisper network. The danger, of course, was that no one was immune. Presidents, first ladies, senators, ambassadors, journalists, all of them could fall victim to the quiet, deadly drip of rumor. But here's the strange thing, many of them also used it. Leaking a piece of scandalous information about an opponent could be just as effective as passing legislation. It was politics without fingerprints. By the end of the decade, this unseen current of gossip had become an art form. And while it rarely appeared in official histories, those who lived and worked in the White House knew the truth. Whispers moved mountains. By the early 1960s, the White House had never looked so glamorous, or so vulnerable to rumor. President John F. Kennedy exuded an effortless charm that captivated not just the American public, but also an astonishing number of women who crossed his path. He was the golden boy of the political world, young, handsome, witty, and always in motion. Yet, behind the crisp suits and iconic smile, whispers circulated about a dangerous game he was playing, one that risked scandal on a scale no previous president had dared. The most famous of these whispered names was Marilyn Monroe. The actress was the ultimate Hollywood fantasy, her breathy voice, her shimmering gowns, and her intoxicating mix of innocence and seduction. Her brief, glittering appearance at Kennedy's 45th birthday gala, singing "Happy Birthday, Mr. President" in a skin-tight, flesh-toned dress, did more to fuel suspicion than 1,000 newspaper stories could. To the public, it was a glamorous, if slightly suggestive, moment. But to those in the know, it was proof that the connection between Kennedy and Monroe went far beyond the stage lights. Monroe's own life was spiraling. Friends later claimed she confided in them about her encounters with the president, how she felt both thrilled and discarded, like a rare gem admired briefly before being locked away. Whether these claims were entirely true or embellished over time hardly mattered. The legend of JFK and Marilyn Monroe had been born, and it was unstoppable. Even Jackie Kennedy, elegant and composed as ever, was not immune to the gossip. Her icy grace in public became a shield against the storm raging in private. But Marilyn wasn't the only woman whose name was tied to Kennedy's. There were countless others, Hollywood starlets, socialites, even staffers. One name that still catches historians' interest is Judith Campbell Exner, a glamorous brunette who admitted to having an affair with JFK. Her story became even more sensational when it emerged she may have also had connections to mob boss Sam Giancana. If true, this meant the President of the United States could have been entangled, however indirectly, in a web linking Hollywood, organized crime, and national politics. The Kennedy brothers, John and Robert, were both known to be magnetic figures, and in Monroe's final months, she was rumored to have been involved with both. This rumor was the kind of thing Washington insiders never put in print, but couldn't resist passing along over cocktails. When Monroe died of an overdose in 1962, the tragedy deepened the mystery. Conspiracy theories bloomed almost immediately. Was it an accident? Suicide? Or something darker, tied to secrets she was thought to be keeping? Meanwhile, Jackie continued her carefully cultivated public role. She was the embodiment of grace under pressure, projecting an image of a perfect marriage even as the truth, whatever it fully was, remained locked behind closed doors. Friends claimed she knew more than she let on, but chose to maintain the image, not just for herself, but for the country. In those years, the First Lady's dignity was seen as inseparable from the dignity of the nation itself. The Kennedy White House became known as Camelot, a mythical realm where youth, beauty, and charm ruled. But like the original Camelot, there was always a hint of tragedy lurking at the edges. The affairs, the whispered rumors, the untimely deaths, they all became part of the legend. And in the decades since, no amount of historical fact-checking has been able to fully erase the intoxicating blend of glamour and scandal that defined JFK's presidency. For many Americans, this was the moment they realized the White House wasn't just a seat of power. It was also a stage, and sometimes, a theater of dangerous desire.